Welcome to Blueprint for Life, the podcast designed to encourage, uplift, and challenge you on your journey. In just a moment, we will be joined by our host, Elder Lawrence McCarter Jr. We are thrilled you are willing to join us on this transformational ride. At Blueprint for Life, we believe each of us has a unique blueprint crafted by God Himself. This podcast will explore how to discover and unlock that blueprint, allowing you to live a life of purpose, fulfillment, and joy. Through insightful conversations, thought-provoking interviews, and biblical truths, we will delve into the keys that can unlock your potential. Together, we will navigate the challenges, setbacks, and triumphs that come our way, always relying on the timeless wisdom found in God's Word.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Blueprint for Life. I am Lawrence. I am your host, and I am happy to be here and to have you here with me. I would say it's been a long time coming, but you'd probably say I didn't know you were coming, so I guess we're even on that. I am so happy to be here. I'm happy to have you listening to me. This is something that I have long wanted to do. It took a while for me to get the courage up, to stiffen my spine, so to speak, to really push myself, and to take the encouragement from those around me. You know how you have those friends and those loved ones who are always standing around you, pushing you, telling you that you're capable of doing this and that, and you always say that, oh, I'd love to do this and I'd love to do that, and there's always those people that are in your corner that saying that, yeah, you should do it, you should really go for it. And we always come up with reasons or excuses for why we can't. So maybe I'm not as smart as I think I am, or maybe I'm not as influential as I think I am, or whatever reasons we come up with a lot of excuses as to why we can't. And I'm just like anybody else. I came up with my reasons, my excuses, and all of those things, but somewhere along the way, I figured I needed to listen, not to myself, not to the voices in my own head that were telling me that I wasn't quite enough, or that my voice wasn't big enough, or that I wasn't well known enough, because I think we all have those voices. We all have those voices in our head that will repeatedly tell us what we aren't. But it's good to have friends, it's good to have family that will tell us what we are, that will remind us what we are to them and what we are to the rest of the world, and what we could be to the rest of the world. To every person that encouraged me, to my mom, to my dad, to my sister, both of them, to my wife, to everyone who said that I should go for it, to my pastor, everyone. There's so many people that I could say this about. My wife Danielle, like I said, my pastor, Reverend Ricky Ray Ezell at Central Baptist Church here in Columbia, South Carolina. So many people. If I start naming names, I'm probably going to get in trouble. So I'd better stop there, because quite frankly, I'd like to maintain the relationships that I have. But to everyone, you know who you are. I want to say thank you to you for encouraging me, for supporting me, for being that voice of encouragement when I didn't know my own worth, when I didn't know, how to proceed on this journey we call life. I want to thank you for being the ones who were still willing to push me, and who were willing to say that I believe in you. Thank you very much. And to everyone else who's listening, reach out to those people who are in your life, who have continued to say that you are awesome, that you're able, that you should do, and you should continue to push. Reach out to those people. Give them a hug. Love up on them, because those people are precious. Those people are incredibly important, and you should never take them for granted, because on the days when you feel like quitting, they're the ones who will push you onto the next leg of the journey. So Love on those people. They are priceless, and they deserve your love and your respect because they are who they are, and we need people like them. Nobody is going to always be the strongest person in their circle. I don't care who you are. I don't care where you come from. I don't care that you always seem to have the happiest disposition of everyone around you. Nobody is always the strongest person in their circle. We all have days where we just don't feel like we're enough. And it's always good to have somebody that you can lean on, somebody that you can entrust yourself to just for a little while, that you can say, hey, I'm just not feeling it today. And they'll come back to you with, you don't have to feel it today, but I'm going to tell you who I see when I look at you. And they're willing to encourage you and tell you just how great of a person you are. All right. That's my little spiel on that. Again, welcome to Blueprint for Life, the podcast where we believe that God has a unique plan for everybody. Not just some of us, not just a few of us. We seem to live in a world where it seems like the select few are the ones that are getting ahead, and the rest of us are just doomed to stand back and watch those few move ahead in life and do all these amazing things, and the rest of us are just going to be watchers and spectators. No, God has a unique plan for everybody. And if we would just take the time to get in touch with the one who writes the blueprint, who draws everything out, then we too could, as most folks like to say, live our best life. All right. Now, let me start with the question that I got from pretty much everybody when I started talking about doing this podcast. And I told them that the name of the podcast was going to be Blueprint for Life. Everybody always came back with, who or what is Blueprint for Life? Like, where'd you come up with this? What's the whole idea behind this idea of a blueprint? All right. Several years ago, and I'm talking like 2015, 2016, somewhere in there, I had actually contemplated planning a church. Okay. My wife and I, we were living in upstate South Carolina at the time, and I had a little bit of experience. I had worked with a close friend and mentor, a guy by the name of Elder Jeremiah Williams. Shout out to my brother from another mother. We had worked with him to plant his church, Blessed Hope Temple, in the upstate. His church is still there in Anderson, South Carolina. The man is a phenomenal preacher, phenomenal evangelist, prolific pastor. The boy can preach, y'all. I don't know what else to say, having watched and witnessed him from where he started, from the time I met him to where he is now. The man has grown both in ministry and in life. I don't know what to tell you, but worked with him to plant his ministry. So I got a chance to see the inner workings of how you go about going into an area where nobody really knows your name, nobody knows where you're from or what your message is, and how you go about attracting an audience, and how you go about doing outreach in the community, and how you go about reaching people. I got a chance to see all of that. And as a result, at the time, I figured, oh, I can do this too. I sat down, pulled everything together, and at the time, the name of the ministry was going to be Blueprint Ministries. And I was ready to go, y'all. I had pulled everything together. I got all my paperwork done. I had done all my paperwork for my 503(1) or whatever. And I was ready. I got all of my stuff sent out, came back, everything. And my purpose, my goal, everything was designed around the belief. And again, I still believe this way. And I hold it very strongly that God did not design this world like the old school clockmakers who would make clocks with the old wind up mechanism. And then once they finished making the clock, they would wind it up and close it. And then once they completed the construction, they closed it, they just left it to run on its own. There are some people who have that belief that, hey, if there's a God, then I guess the closest that he has gotten to people is that he made this world, and then once he finished, he walked away and left it to run on its own. Nah, I didn't believe that. I didn't think that God would do that. Not a loving God. So I was convinced that was not how he had designed this thing. I was actually convinced, and the ministry that I desired to create and structure was that God had actually been very intentional about creating not only this world, but he had also been very intentional about creating each of us. He created each of us very intentionally, and he also created us with enduring purpose. And he did so because he had very unique plans for us. He had designs for our lives that were intended to create a perfect happiness specific to each one of us. And just like the old saying goes that there are no two people alike, I believed, and I still do, that God's plans take account for that, and that there are no two plans. So just God made each of us and that there's no two people alike, I also felt that there were no two plans. As I began to think on what those plans might look like if we could see them on paper, my mind began to gravitate toward a blueprint. You see where I'm going here? I looked at Proverbs, the 14th chapter, 12th verse, and it says that there is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And see, it seems to me, and if you look back through history seems to support my belief that when mankind tries to go our own way without aligning ourselves with true biblical precepts, and this is important, when we go our own way without aligning ourselves with true biblical precepts, it doesn't seem to go so well. Not only does it not go well, but it also breeds trouble for everybody involved. Now, I'm not just saying this because I can. I'm saying this because I actually have a couple examples. And I'm not going to go through the entire history book because, first of all, this is the podcast launch. And while I may have stuck my foot in it and announced that this podcast was going to be an hour long, I promise you we don't have enough time for me to go through everything, every way in which we have royally screwed ourselves. Okay? I don't have that kind of time. Now, granted, this first podcast is going to be an hour long, but every other podcast from here on out is only going to be around 30 minutes long. Okay? I just want to put y'all minds at ease. Back to what I was saying. I have a few examples that show that when we get involved, mankind, and we get to trying to do our own thing, and we get away from true biblical precepts, things don't go well for us. And we create trouble for everybody that's involved, even going so far as to get other folks wrapped up in the trouble that we create. Okay? And I'm not going to go back that far. Okay? I don't want to go back too far, because I still want this to be somewhat relevant to our minds. All right? Let's talk about a little something that some of us may be familiar with, some of us not so much. But there's this little thing called the doctrine of discovery. All right? And I'm not going to be super technical and all historical and start naming off a bunch of names and dates and whatnot. This is not a history class. There is not going to be a test after this. You are not going to be required to remember all of this or anything. I just want you to get the gist of what I'm talking about. This is just something that I think is worth talking about, and it's a good starting place. And it'll also lead into my other two examples. All right. So the doctrine of discovery was issued by Pope Alexander VI, and he did this on May 4th, 1493. All right. Now you may recognize that 1493 is the year after Christopher Columbus thought he had made his way to India, and he mistakenly gets credit for having discovered America, which what he actually did was stumbled into the Bahamas. All right, but we're not gonna beat on old Chris too much. But this doctrine of discovery was issued by the Pope at that time, and it played a central role in the Spanish conquest of the New World. Okay? So, essentially what this doctrine did is it created or established, really, a demarcation line. All right? And gave Spain a monopoly in all lands west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands. All right. Now, these are the islands that are to the west of Africa. So everything to the west of these islands, somehow the Pope told Spain they could have everything to the west of that. Now, I'm not quite sure who told the Pope he could do that, but that's what he did. I don't know. I really don't understand the thinking of the time that would allow someone to think that just because they stumbled onto some land and, hey, nobody that looks like me is living on it, I guess I own it now, and I can decide what to do with it. But anyway, even beyond that, the doctrine of discovery, it had a little caveat to it. Additional language within the doctrine of discovery allowed the lands to be exploited by Christian rulers, and also declared that the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. Now, if you trace that a little further down, this doctrine was actually the basis for the U.S. Supreme Court case Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823. Okay, just shy of 400 years later, it was used by Chief Justice John Marshall to establish the opinion that the the principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to New World lands. And it was unanimously upheld, and the law essentially stated that American Indians, or who we know as natives, had only a right of occupancy, which could be abolished. So essentially what the Doctrine of Discovery did was say that if you are west of Africa, Spain owned or could have conquest over all of those lands. And all of the Christian rulers, essentially from Spain, could exploit those lands, and that the Catholic faith and Christian religion was to be spread throughout those lands. So now, you're making Christianity look bad, because that ain't what Jesus told his disciples to do. All he did is tell the disciples to go ye out into all the world, teaching and preaching the gospel. He didn't say anything about attacking anyone, killing anyone, putting anyone to death, forcing anyone to convert. None of that. All he said was going out into the world, teaching and preaching the gospel. And yet here, the Catholic Church, the Pope, no less, is giving away land that doesn't belong to him, and essentially giving permission to the kings and queens of Spain and the Christian religions, so to speak, quote unquote Christian religions, to overthrow barbarous nations and force them to be brought to the faith. Now, as I said before, when mankind tries to go our own way without aligning ourselves with true biblical precepts, it doesn't go so well. And it also breeds trouble for everyone involved. Proverbs 14:12, there is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Example number 1. Okay, so let's go with example number 2. Example 2 is a little thing called manifest destiny. Now, some people may have heard about it. Some may not have. This is something that is exclusively very American. But this is another one of those occasions that has a lot of non-Christians, and especially atheists and other skeptics with a rocky relationship with the church. They point to it and ask, what is wrong with you people? And quite frankly, I honestly think they have a point. Manifest destiny was a phrase that was coined by a man named John L. O'Sullivan in 1845. And he was a journalist who believed that this country was blessed by providence, or by God, to become an ocean-bound republic. Now, this phrase was originally controversial because, see, Northerners thought it was code for spreading slavery. And then its critics were ridiculing the expansionists. You had some politicians who just flat out opposed it. And then you had some expansionists that felt that they had failed because they hadn't taken over Mexico and Canada. Now, prior to the coining of the phrase, the western expansion of the United States began in 1803 when President Thomas Jefferson managed the Louisiana Purchase And that was roughly 828,000 square miles of land stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. He managed to get that for about $15 million from France. Okay, Napoleon is in the middle of a war with England, and I guess he needed the money. So he managed to pull off, I guess, the purchase of a millennia to get that much land. That's literally pennies on the dollar. But see, the trouble with that particular purchase is that the owners, which we would refer to them as the people that were actually living on the land, the indigenous people, they had no idea that the land that they were living on had just been sold out from under them. Okay? Now, the idea behind Manifest Destiny was what led to cries for the re-annexation of Texas in 1830 and its eventual admission to the Union as a state in December of 1845. In the July to August 1845 issue of the Democratic Review and in a July 1845 article in the New York Morning News, John O'Sullivan coined the phrase Manifest Destiny when criticizing the opposition that lingered against the annexation of Texas and in reference to the Oregon Territory, which was another frontier that the United States was looking at. This idea that it was God or God's will that America be some kind of ocean-bound republic. I honestly don't imagine he cared. I believe that God's will permits for man's desires, for man's free will. But for God to get so deeply entrenched with national and international politics, God doesn't care about your political affiliations. He's not concerned with what party affiliation you have. Even now, we live in a country where Republicans claim to be the party of morals and values, and they claim to somehow be the party of God. I don't get it. Because yet and still, in the midst of all of that, it seems every time we turn around, you find another Republican who is getting caught in some kind of weird anti-Christian scandal, doing something that is decidedly un-Christian, getting caught in some kind of sex scandal. You get photographed and somebody looks over and is, "Oh, that's not your wife," or "Madam, that's not your husband." And again, I'm not one to judge. The Bible says, "Judge not lest ye be judged." It's not saying that because we're not permitted to judge, so much as we should be mindful of how we judge, because we'll be judged according to the same ruler that we judge by. But the truth of the matter is, God does not care about our political affiliations. He doesn't care whether you are Republican, Democrat, Independent. He doesn't care about any of that. His chief concern is more about the state of your soul than whether or not you voted in the last election. But then on to my third example, which is the American experiment. Now, I've heard very mixed opinions on this particular social experiment. Now, to some, this is an experiment that is still alive and well. We're still in the middle of it, still trying to figure out whether it's been successful or not. To others, the American experiment has succeeded, and this particular generation is the proof of its success. We've succeeded, and this generation is the evidence that we have succeeded. This generation is the wealthiest generation that we've ever had. This generation has shown the least amount of sickness, and we have fought off the most illnesses, and our medical community has jumped by leaps and bounds, and we have private citizens that are financing trips to space, and that's seen as its success. And you still have others who are unwilling to offer their opinion, stating that there's a lack of conclusive evidence. I guess if you don't want to upset anybody, you can stand on the fence and not make a decision. But then there are people like me who feel that the experiment has been an abject failure. All right. So now, what is the American experiment? American experiment was meant to be this grand social experiment where those who set out from Europe initially, whether they intended it to be or not, I don't know if they realized when they left out of Europe that's what it was going to be, but that's what it became. But it was this experiment to prove that a group of people could come together and they could establish a government that was permanently maintained without any kind of hereditary or self-appointed rulers, that could not only espouse but practice the principles of equal rights, general suffrage, and government by a majority. Additionally, it was supposed to be seen whether this country could exist without privileged classes and without a standing army. Let's see. I would venture to say that the only one of those that we haven't failed miserably at was the standing army. And even there, we lost a step during the Vietnam War because this country instituted the draft. Which, let's be honest, the draft was incredibly classist and racist, because if you were black, brown, or poor, your only real choices were the Army or the Marines. Okay? Then, this country may have begun with pretty ideals, but even its inception was marred by the dichotomy between all men being created equal and the 3/5 rule. Which, if you don't know what the 3/5 rule was, it was essentially saying that, on the one hand, all men are created equal, but we don't count black men because black men only constitute 3/5 of a man. So, since he's not a real man, he can be owned as property. How do you equate the fact that all men are created equal when you've just taken away someone else's right to be counted as a human? It's difficult. Equal rights isn't so equal if you have to have a qualifier like separate but equal. Okay? And general suffrage, that sounds nice. Up until you have to be reminded that women didn't get the right to vote until 1920. And even though you had women of color, Mary Louise Bottineau Baldwin, Dr. Mabel Ping Hua Lee, or Nina Otero Warren, who made major contributions to the cause, by the way, they got sidelined. And black folks didn't get the right to vote that had actually been promised by the 15th Amendment in 1870 until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So nearly 100 years later, do we actually get the promised rights that we had been given? And don't get me started on the privileged class, okay? You have lifelong politicians who make decisions that they will never be affected by. And they make more money from having their palms greased by people who buy their votes than we the people who actually pay them. And then you have people who are famous and wealthy, not for doing anything meaningful or beneficial, but because they were born to someone who is or did, or worse, just for being famous. Now, I want you to make that make sense, all right? Now, an article I read as I was preparing for this podcast, and I read it just because I like to read random things that follow my interests. It's a habit of mine. Actually, a pretty good habit because it keeps me well read. But anyway, I was, preparing for all of this, and I ran across this article. And in this article, it was actually a article that was written back in like 1860. And I think it was supposed to be 15 months prior to what happened at Fort Sumter that essentially caused the split between the North and the South. Okay, but the author, he talked about how the author talked about how he did not believe in the prevailing thought at his time that a great class would arise, and this is, I'm quoting this, says that a great class would arise of mere laborers, destitute of property, to whom the right of suffrage could not be safely entrusted. Now, I believe that what the author thought was impossible has actually happened, and is actually counted on to continue happening so that the current system can remain in place. Because think about it. We no longer have a middle class. Not really, not anymore. Because think about it. You either have or you don't. There's not really much room in the middle anymore. Because once upon a time, there were those who were incredibly rich. There were those who were incredibly poor. And then those people in the middle, they were managing. Those were the people who had, the husband went to work, he had a decent job, he had a pension that he was working on. The wife, she stayed at home, she minded the kids, she made sure the dinner was on the table when everyone got home. They had the house, the car, the white picket fence, the 2 kids and the dog, that whole ideal. And the husband made enough to ensure that all of the bills were paid and there was money in the retirement fund. And they never had to worry about losing everything. But now, with the way that everything is set up now, you have more single parent homes than really have ever existed at any time in our country's history. And these aren't single parent homes due to loss of life. We're not talking about during wartime when men went off to war after having started a family and lost their lives during wartime, and the women had to raise the children by themselves because the husband was no longer alive. We're talking about single parent homes due to either failure to plan or intentional decisions, or even a divorce rate that essentially is 50%. 1 out of every 2 marriages in this country ends in divorce. And that's at the last time I looked at the statistics, which has been a while. So you're talking about a middle class that has disappeared because we can barely, even as citizens of this country, can barely survive because the economy says, okay, a single parent home struggles to survive because in general, it takes at least a 2-income earning household to just barely get by. I think the last statistics I saw said that in order for a household to function, not thrive, just function, it takes 2 earners making $80,000 a year to just function in our economy. That's terrifying. Utterly terrifying. So the question then becomes, what do you have to do in order to survive? And you have a lot of people who are turning to the more illicit methods of getting ahead. But then that eventually, whether it's you get caught when you're first starting out, or you eventually get caught after you've stacked up a bit, but eventually that does not work out. And it causes problems. So you have the haves, and then you have the have-nots. And the have-nots tend to outnumber the haves. And the have-nots spend so much time trying to survive that they don't have time to focus on much else, including participating in any of our civil responsibilities, like voting in any of your local, municipal, state, or even national level elections. When you start talking about following up on issues that affect our individual communities and staying on top of our representatives to ensure that they put our interest above our own, who has time for that? I don't. Do any of you? Let's be realistic about this. So then we end up with representatives who don't necessarily represent us. Sure, they get into office because they make a lot of promises, but who's watching them to ensure that they actually keep those promises? Who's there to make sure that they're actually doing what they said they were going to do? And as they say, when the cat is out, the mice will play. So when we as the citizen is not able to keep our eyes on what our supposed representatives are up to, sure, they're going to get into a whole bunch of mess. They're going to do all kinds of things that we didn't ask them to do. Why? Because it pads their pockets. And as I said earlier, when history holds it up. When mankind tries to go our own way without aligning ourselves with true biblical concepts or precepts, it don't go well, and it breeds trouble for everyone involved. Let's bring it back to the blueprint. There was 3 examples that I wanted to show what happens when mankind tries to go our own way without aligning ourselves with true biblical precepts. That not only does it not go well, but it breeds trouble for everyone involved. And truth be told, even people who were originally uninvolved get pulled into the insanity. These 3 examples show that over the course of history, the decisions made by a few had global implications. But what if they had trusted God? What if they had, instead of reading their own intent and desires and selfishness into the scriptures, they had instead took what the Bible said at face value and accepted what God had written as truth and lived by it? See, there was once this group of Jewish leaders who had attempted to test and entrap Jesus, and questioning him, he was asked in Matthew, the 22nd chapter, 36 through the 40th verse. Man said to him, "Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law?" And Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." Now, let's consider these 2 commandments given by Jesus individually. First, the commandment to love the Lord your God. Jesus broke out the big guns immediately, okay? So when Jesus used the word Lord here, and I promise I'm not going to get all super technical and all preachy, but he used this term. That term refers to someone who holds a position of authority over you. So Jesus established from the very beginning where the authority lies. Then he goes on to say to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and says that's the foremost commandment. So, for those who truly love someone, this will make sense. If you truly love somebody, this will make sense. All right? If you truly love someone, you will do all you can to make that person happy. You'll move heaven and earth to make them happy. You will also do all you can not to displease that person. You'll learn their likes and dislikes so that you can make them happy and not make them unhappy. Now that sounds simple enough, but it's actually an incredibly difficult thing to do. In the process of making them happy or avoiding making them unhappy, you will likely end up doing some serious mental gymnastics as you do, or say, or avoid doing or saying things that either don't come natural to you or that come naturally to you. And I promise you, your mind will at times yell at you and tell you, "I don't bend that way." But your love for that person will cause you to become more and more flexible. And just when you feel like you're going to break, you'll find a bit more flexibility you never knew you had, and you'll bend a little more. So loving your God with all your heart, soul, and mind is like that. You are having to acknowledge his absolute authority over you willingly. And as a result of that love, you will feel a desire, more than a desire, a need to know more about him so that you can do things that make him happy and not do the things that make him unhappy. That will mean you reading and studying his word, spending time with those who do the same, worshiping him and worshiping him alongside other worshipers. Then we get to the second command. Jesus said that the second command was to love your neighbor as yourself. He didn't say as best as you can, and he didn't say like your best friend. He said as yourself. Now, generally speaking, most people would not seek to actively harm themselves. Now, with no evidence or appearance of trauma, mental illness, or other issues that could change your mental or physical state away from what is typically and generally accepted as the norm, most people would not seek to harm themselves. Most people wouldn't seek to mistreat themselves. As a matter of fact, all of those original statements being true, most people would seek to treat themselves fairly well. If you had to choose between eating out of trash cans for the rest of your life or eating the best possible prepared meals, most would choose the prepared meal. If you had to choose between living in the gutter or in a mansion where all of your meals are prepared, your clothing is custom made from the finest fabrics on earth, and the chauffeur took you wherever you wanted to go and paid for anything you wanted with a card whose bill was automatically paid from a trust that could never run dry, I am pretty sure most people would not choose the gutter. Jesus' command was for us to treat our neighbors just like we would treat ourselves. And it seems like such a crazy concept. It's a concept that blows all of the previous examples away. Because if those who had been making the rules, those who called themselves Christians, which means to be Christ-like, what kind of shape could this world be in now? Think about it. Now, let me address the elephant in the room, because I always get this question, so I want to address it right now. You're probably already thinking it. Wasn't there slavery in the Bible? Isn't that just hypocritical? Okay. Yes, slavery existed and was practiced during the first century by many different cultures. No, that's not hypocritical. Now, we're almost at the end, but before you get all angry and judgmental, give me a moment to explain. Slavery as an institution predates written records, going back over 11,000 years. So it's not something that just popped up in and around Jerusalem just before, during, and after Jesus' lifetime. Evidence exists of slavery during the Mesopotamian and Sumerian civilization. So the job title of slaver and slave likely tie or are a close second and third for the oldest profession. And if you don't know what the oldest profession is, please go ask your parents. Anyway, the Bible itself is a total of 66 books written by 40 different authors over the course of about 1,500 years. It was not written to overtake any particular culture, but rather it was written to chronicle a few things. And I'm not about to give you an exhaustive list. This is just an overview. It was meant to chronicle God's creation of the world and man, man's fall and why man needs a savior, the lengths God went to in order to bring man a savior, how God desires to establish his relationship with his creation, and how we as his creation are to interact with a holy and righteous God who loved us so much he refused to entrust our salvation to anything less than himself, because nothing less was sufficient. All right, now go ahead and get your shout out the way. Now, The Bible may have existed as a chronicle of God's interactions with man and vice versa, but that did not change the fact that other peoples and cultures existed before and outside the influence of the lands mentioned in the biblical text. So I want you to think for a moment. The biblical text really only covers a small part of the overall globe. That did not mean that those other lands didn't exist, just that they were outside the sphere of influence at the time. Slavery existed prior to the biblical record and wasn't going to just simply disappear because Jesus appeared on the scene. His teachings and the teachings of the disciples/apostles after his death, however, had and continues to have an impact on things like slavery. Consider for a moment the teaching that the Apostle Paul does on the subject in Ephesians 6 chapter 5th through 9th verse. Paul said, "Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will render service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. And masters, do the same things to them and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality to him." So rather than attacking the institution, which would make an enemy of the master and encourage violence from the slave, Paul created a solution where both would see each other as brothers and sisters in Christ. One thing to understand is that over the course of history, slavery has taken on a variety of connotations due to the circumstances surrounding it. And there have been times and civilizations whereby an individual was able to sell themselves into slavery to satisfy a debt or even to stave off starvation. Not all slavery was the brutal institution we of the 21st century are most familiar with in the transatlantic slave trade, where Africans were brutally enslaved on a global scale from the 16th to the 19th century. Now, I ain't saying that slavery of any kind is a good thing, nor am I saying that God led the writers of Scripture to support slavery. But what I am saying is that context is king. It is important to understand the context in which what you read was written, and to understand that the writers wrote what God inspired them to write within the specific context, and God's guidance was given according to what was already going on at the time. So I want you to bear in mind, it becomes easier to understand Jesus and therefore the Christian stance, or at least what it was supposed to be, when you read Paul's letter to Philemon and see that Paul sent Onesimus, a runaway slave, back to his master Philemon, because Onesimus had received salvation through Paul's teaching, but he was still a slave to Philemon. He still belonged to Philemon. So Paul sent a letter through Onesimus and sent him back to Philemon, apologizing for having kept him so long and asking him not to blame Onesimus. Told him how beneficial he was and asking him to take him back not as a slave, but as a beloved brother in Christ, receiving him just like he would Paul. Now, that's not evidence of somebody loving their neighbor as themselves. I don't know what is. It has come to the end of my time. I don't want to hold you any longer than I have to. But before I end, I want to take this time, as this is the last day of February 29th, 2024. And this is a leap year, and I felt like this was an auspicious day to begin this journey with all of you. I want to just take a moment to celebrate our Black history and to say to each one of you who are listening, no matter what color you are, no matter what your background is. We can all celebrate Black history because Black history is everybody's history. There's always something in our history that has affected everybody's history. So I encourage you to learn more about Black folks because you'll, in doing so, learn something about yourselves. It has been a wonderful time. I have enjoyed you. I thank you for going on this journey with me, and I encourage you to keep going with me. If you desire, if you have any input, if you want to have a particular subject to talk about, if you would like to have questions asked or answered on the podcast or even privately, go to the website, blueprintforlifepodcast.com, and submit your questions on the Ask a Preacher page. Okay? Make it known whether you'd like it to be public or private, and I will do my utmost to answer your questions. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, a wonderful life. God bless you. I love you all. Take care.
Hey there, fellow listeners. As we wind down another inspiring episode of Blueprint for Life, we want to thank you for tuning in. Remember, you can always find more uplifting content and past episodes on our website or your favorite podcast platform. Join us next time for more faith-filled conversations and stories that fuel your spirit. Until then, stay blessed and keep shining your light.